Hello, everybody, and welcome back to UXchange, the podcast where I exchange my user experiences to change them, and yours for the better. I'm Jeremy, a mentor and senior user researcher with over 8 years of experience and a background in neuroscience. Throughout my career, I've had the privilege of engaging with hundreds of users around the world, spanning across Europe, the USA, Africa, and India. This has allowed me to deliver actionable insights that have improved user experiences with nutrition, automotive, delivery, and e-commerce sectors. I've created this podcast with the aim of providing my mentorship and educational content, offering actionable tips, knowledge, and guidance in the realm of research, specifically focusing on UX research to anyone having an interest in this area. And I hope that you will find this episode insightful.
One, two, three, four.
Let's get started with this second episode in this 3-episode series on how to scope a UX research project. So in this episode, I think it will be pretty short, but in this episode, I wanted to tackle 2 sections. The first one being when you should scope a UX research project and the format you should adopt, whether you are a freelancer or working inside a company. And just as a reminder, if you haven't done so, please check the first episode on how to scope a UX research project, in which I outline the rationale behind why you should scope your UX research project, what it can bring you. And so, without further ado, let's start. So first of all, when should you scope a UX research project? Well, naturally, this is fairly simple. As early as possible. When you receive your request from a stakeholder, you should ask yourself all the questions that I will outline in the 3rd episode of this 3-episode series on how to scope a UX research project. So as early as possible. So, of course, you have already guessed it, but the real info here is why. Probably you already guessed as well, but the earlier you scope your UX research project, the better for you for several reasons. The first one is that you will decrease substantially the risk of making mistakes further down the road when you conduct your UX research project. And so all the specifics regarding the needs of your stakeholders, previous research on the topic, and so on, will already have been tackled and answered beforehand. And also, you will see in this framework, as I include questions that if you answer them, you will actually know if you should run or not your UX research project. By doing so, you should avoid the common pitfalls that I ran into, which were running a UX research project and then seeing that my insights have not been acted upon. And basically, this is why I actually was doubting about doing this episode, because I thought it will be really trivial what I'm about to say. But in the end, as we can observe every day in UX research practice, it's not that trivial, because we see many UX researchers rushing through to conduct a UX research project without even asking themselves first these kind of questions. So maybe we think it's so much trivial that in the end we dismiss that, we take it for granted, and we end up actually not asking ourselves these questions. And so that can end up being a waste of time and a waste of money. So yeah, as you would have guessed, the first aspect is, of course, answering all the necessary questions before starting your UX research project, so that you make sure you're aligned with your stakeholders regarding the need, regarding the questions your stakeholders have, regarding the priorities, the timeline, and so on. And also if you should run a UX research project at all. And also to decrease the waste of time, to reduce the waste of time. Because even if you ask yourself these questions further down the road, asking yourselves these questions on a how can I say, on a only if needed basis, you will lose a tremendous amount of time, because you will multiply the back and forth discussions between you and your stakeholders, and this is everything but efficient. So it's better to align upfront from the very beginning, align on the questions, the interest from the stakeholders, the need, and so on, but like in a bucket, and so that, okay, now we're good to go. So think about the problem first before rushing into a solution. And I know as UX researchers, we don't think about solution. By solution here, I mean the research itself, the approach of the research you're gonna adopt is a solution in itself, is a solution to an industrial problem. So in this case, your solution is the research project, so don't rush into the solution before thinking about the problem being the request from the stakeholder. What is the actual request? And so it's also possible, so I'm saying here, and again, this might sound trivial, and I'm sorry if this is the case. Hopefully in the third part of this, if this sounds trivial in the third part of these 3 series episodes, it will make more sense and you will probably find more value. But I thought it was interesting to do this episode because it's a natural continuation of the first one. And so, as I was saying, probably you will not have all the answers to all the questions up front before starting. Don't worry. So, first of all, it will make more sense when you will see all the questions, what I'm saying now, because there are a lot of questions. So if you see all of that when I will communicate with you my framework, don't be scared. You will most probably not have all the answers to your questions every time before starting every project. And actually, to be fairly transparent with you, it's not actually the case with me, with myself. So in this case, just remember that in my framework that I will outline to you, you have 3 sections. And these 3 sections have to be tackled by order of priority before starting a UX research project. And in my opinion, they act as kind of filters. So, and these filters are like leveled. So you have the first filter is like the more harsh. I don't know if this makes sense, but this is the more harsh filter. If your request passes this filter, then it passes through a second filter, which is less harsh. Well, actually, if it passes the first filter, you can be pretty confident you will run the research. But then the second filter is more about how to run the research. And the third filter is actually not very much a filter, it's like specifics, so that you can tweak it a little bit. But this is how it works. And the 3 parts is actually fairly simple. The first one is actually, should I run the research project? So that's why I'm saying it's the most harsh of the filters, because it's actually, if the request doesn't express the need, actually, or between the lines for a UX research, a user research, and by this I mean actual user sessions and interactions with users. If this is not the case, well, you don't run UX research and you concentrate your efforts onto something else. So that's why I'm saying it's the most harsh of the filters. Then the second filter, which is not so much of a filter, again, it's more like, okay, now we passed the first filter. We know we should run the research, but now how big the research should be. It's still a filter, because if your stakeholder comes to you and says, I don't know, I want to run a qualitative study with 4 groups of people in that amount of time, blah, 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 and that amount of countries, and so on. Maybe you can ask some questions and refine the need. So that's why I'm still calling it a filter, because you filter out the unnecessary and you keep only the relevant. So it's still a filter in my opinion. And the last step in this framework is more the specifics. Okay, now you know the research, you know you should conduct research, you know how big the research should be. Should it be heavy research, like discovery, or more evaluative? And the last one is, what are the actual details I should know before kicking off this project? So here, I don't know, probably what is the previous knowledge we have on this topic? I don't know, a rationale behind the design decisions. I actually don't remember exactly what I put inside all of the categories, and this is not the purpose of this episode. I will tell you in the last episode, but this is the goal. And so, as I was saying, you should not have the answers to all of your questions all at once and before starting. Actually, it doesn't make that much sense, because, and I will tell you after why, but you should at least prioritize. So, the first section first, should I run my research project? Once you have all these answers, maybe you can also ask the other questions. How big should this research be? And the last thing is, okay, now that we know we should plan the research, okay, let's move forward. You can also do it all at once. It really depends on the configuration of your company and the workload of everyone and so on. So this was about when you should scope your UX research project. And again, everything that I'm discussing here, like the research plans and any material that I communicate to you, this type of material that is like alignment before starting a research, of course, see it as a living thing. So it really depends, because, of course, you cannot do a harsh modification of a research plan while you're doing the research. It should not be the case. But some aspects sometimes of planning research should be living. It's like, okay, I planned something, but maybe just before I start the research, we discovered something else. So maybe we should tweak one question. And maybe this should be a game changer by just adding this very question. So think about this. Everything that I'm saying here, adapt depending on your circumstances or on your needs, and also on the ways of working on the company, for instance, and depending on also what you find along the way. So don't try to not be rigid. Try to be a change agent and to adapt along the way. So then the second section I wanted to cover today is about the format. How should this scoping take place? How should it be? And basically, the format is not that important. The most important is that you have all these questions at hand, close to you, in a way that you can easily retrieve them. So it can be a Google Doc, it can be Google Sheets, it can be a Miro, a Notion, whatever. It can be something you wrote on a piece of paper and that you always have near you. It really doesn't matter. Of course, the easiest, and as always, will if you're doing UX research tied to technology, of course, you will use shared tools, and the better for you. Now we are entering like the sneaky aspects of conducting UX research with stakeholders. The best thing is try to integrate yourself into the way into the way your stakeholders are working. So if you manage to communicate these questions in a seamless way to them, you increase the chance they will actually answer them without much effort. So you decrease the friction so that you actually increase collaboration. And I tried it very recently with my stakeholders. So again, before I was in another company, it was very seamless. It was very easy to communicate, and I arrived at a new company, and in this case, I discovered that, well, actually the team worked in a very reactive manner, and it was like, okay, we ask, you execute, and it's like we ask once, and then if we have questions, if the UX researchers have questions, well, they better find the answers themselves, because it will be difficult to reach the stakeholders who are very busy. And I'm not saying this in a bad way. This is just how things are. You should just be prepared for that. In this case, what I discovered, which was maybe not so much the case before, because I could align, for instance, over Slack. Now it's not so much the case. It's not so quick. I, for instance, share my research plans by email, and I give a link. Imagine it's a OneDrive document or a Google Doc, and, well, stakeholders go there whenever they have the time. And it's also a way to create bonds with stakeholders, to increase trust, because you're more transparent. So yeah, find the way that works best for your company and your ways of working. To be really honest, that's one of the most difficult things I found in being a UX researcher. Is about, I love collaboration, but it's about discovering the specifics and the preferences of each one, so that in the end you maximize the output of everyone. So that everyone put together is more than the sum of its parts, you know? So yeah, in this case, you can have your questions whenever you want, because in the end, they are more for you than for someone else. But if you can have them in a place where it's easily collaborative for your stakeholders, of course, seems trivial, but I wanted also to add this point just in case. And in this case, so you will have several formats in any case to ask yourself all these questions. You can actually run what we call stakeholders interviews, which is the most common form of asking this type of questions. But again, it really depends on the configuration of your company, because your stakeholders might not have the time to run interviews with that many questions all at once, for instance. Or if you split them into 3 parts according to my framework, maybe they don't have the time to have 3 meetings, but maybe they have. So try and do what's best for you. For instance, what I did over the course of my experience as a UX researcher was stakeholders interview first, but I also did simply sharing a document like a Google Doc, and they answered my questions inside it. It also, I didn't mention, it also really depends on the stakeholder. So maybe even if the ways of working at your company are of a certain type, one stakeholder might be super agile when another is not. So it also really depends. So sometimes try again with someone else. And then when you get to know more of the stakeholders, you can choose the channel that works best. So again, sorry, to come back to it. It can be a Google Doc, it can be a Notion, you align on it. It can be only sending the questions by email. Sometimes it's very efficient. If you do that, I really advise against bombarding your stakeholders with all your questions, to be honest, because you will scare them. So, UX research in a lot of places has to prove its place and its value to the stakeholders. So you should decrease the friction, again, as much as possible. Your stakeholders, and I know it's putting a lot of weight on your shoulders, but your stakeholders should feel that it's easy to come to you and to request you something. And in the end, it's kind of a superpower to understand what are the stakeholders' needs, even if they don't formulate them well. Because it's also a skill to be able to relate what your stakeholders are asking with the business, the needs of the business, the previous knowledge we have on the topic, and so on. So eventually, don't bombard your stakeholders with questions and only ask the critical questions. At each step of the framework, you have critical questions. So the first step in itself is critical, which is, should I run a research? Then the second one is, how big should be the research? In this section, you have critical questions such as, what is the risk if we launch the product without any research beforehand? You also have some questions such as, what amount of research do we have on this? And so on and so forth. So if you do it over email or by writing, or if you include this as a template in a Jira ticket, try not to scare your stakeholders and only put the really, really necessary ones. And finally, another way that really worked for me, it was amazing actually, is through a workshop. It's really that simple. And this works for projects in which there is a high complexity. So when you see that the request is not clear, actually, there may be a need to brainstorm with your stakeholders firsthand. So it's like, okay, imagine they come to you with some analytics justifying the problem. Well, partly because maybe it's not enough. So you can then try to ask them a lot of questions, but they might not know the answers. So what you can do is try to gather everyone inside of... it's not only because of that a workshop is essential in this case. It's also because probably there are a lot of ways to answer these requests and a lot of different research strategies, and sometimes even different research projects embedded into one. So in this case, gather several stakeholders such as a data analyst, a product designer, a business stakeholder, a product manager, and so on, and gather them to ask them about their perspectives about this problem, basically. And then, when you have the perspective of everyone, you can try to build a coherent story. And maybe it's a story with several, how can I say, several perspectives inside it. And so in this case, maybe you have several milestones that you should cover. And that's why a workshop could be a great way to go. In any case, I didn't mention, but what seems to be important to me is you can have all these questions laid out, but don't see them only as questions. Yes, they are questions, but they don't need to be all asked to someone. In the end, you are a researcher. So, as a researcher, try to act yourself, try to be the example you want to showcase to people inside your company. So as a researcher, you should be the example of, how can I say, you should communicate the best example of how research should be conducted. And research is not necessarily with users. Research starts with looking for information to answer some questions we don't know the answers to. It's as simple as that. And then you use different methodologies. Of course, you do user research, so you do your research with users. This is the core of your activity, but you're also a researcher. So you can also research with other methodologies, such as desk research, such as analyzing the customer feedback in the App Store or any other tool, benchmarking, past research done on a topic. So yeah, try also to gather this information yourself. Also, for another reason, is that if you gather this information yourself, it will ease the discussion, first of all, because if you only take it for granted that people will give you all the information you need, this is very dangerous to think this way for several reasons. Because first, there is a high amount of trust that you put in other people. And I'm not saying not to trust them. I'm just saying that you cannot have 100% trust in other collaborators when they are overwhelmed with other type of work, with other priorities and so on. It's not their job to answer your requests 24/7 and your questions 24/7. So in the end, you should trust the time you have and the resources you have to the best of your abilities, because some of the questions you will never have the answers, even if you try to look for them as much as possible. So try to also identify what information can you find from the documents that you have and from the links that you have inside the company, the resources, the documentation, the knowledge base, and so on. Try to identify that. If you have that, then you can go to your stakeholders already with a base for discussion, saying, okay, look, I found this information. Can we build on top of this? Maybe you have something else, Because if you don't do this, it's like you're slowed down. You're like late in the research process. You lose an opportunity every interaction you will have with your stakeholders to go a bit a step ahead even more. So that's the point. And also, if you only rely on your stakeholders, they can forget and they cannot mention some aspect. It happens. It's human. They might not think about something. So I'm not saying this in a bad way. I'm just saying this is reality. And so sometimes when you arrive at the end of the project and you present your insights, and it happened to me, and I was told, yeah, well, you didn't consider this or that, like this business aspect, this technical feasibility, and so on and so forth, And this could have been sometimes, not every time, but maybe sometimes could have been avoided with proper research at the beginning. Or sometimes it's not only this, it's just knowing where to look for. It's not always easy when you're new in a company and you don't know where information is stored, but do your best. That's the point, and it will only serve you well. So that's pretty much it for the episode of today. I hope you enjoyed it. I know this was a bit trivial, the information communicated, but maybe not. The point of this episode for me is at least to communicate to you one thing. If there is at least one thing that you learned, I'm happy. So that was the goal. And in the third episode, just for a reminder, you will have access to my framework. I will present it orally, and I will also give link to it, to my Medium channel, to my Substack, and also to a link to a Google Doc with my framework. So I hope you will like it. And again, the goal of this framework is for you to cherry pick all the questions that you might need an answer to before starting a UX research project, when you scope it, and even when you already started it a bit, but you need to refine it. So that was it for the episode of today. I was very happy to do it. And again, thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. If you like this episode and all the others, please subscribe and share this show with your friends and colleagues. And see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.
Yo.